Again, it's my privilege to be here tonight and to be with our beloved brethren and sisters for the ministry of the Scriptures. Let's turn to the book of Judges. I think all know what we have in our minds tonight, or what the brethren have asked that we do this evening. I should say, just before I do read the Scriptures, I will just make one simple observation, and that is that it's kind of my task tonight is like looking at an iceberg. I'm sure that all are aware that when we view an iceberg, we see 10% of the material available. 90% is not seen, it's underneath the water. And I began to look at some of these things just this afternoon again. And as I was looking at the book of Judges, I thought to myself, well, some of the nights that will follow this night of ministry, our brethren will give us the other 90%, and it's just 10% that I present this evening. So that's just a caveat, and I'm not being disingenuous by that. I really do mean that there is material available that will help in the division of the book of Judges, in the structure of the book of Judges, in the chronology of the book of Judges, in the timeline associated with the book of Judges, that I likely won't fully develop tonight. And it's material that is very valid, and if I can help any of our brethren by passing on some of those resources or links to those resources, I'd be very happy to do that. Now, the book of Judges and chapter 1. And let's read from verse number 1. Now, after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites, first to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Now, let's go over into chapter 2. And look with me at verse number 6. There's actually two introductions to this book. And verse number 6 of chapter 2 gives us the second part, or the second stage of the introduction to the book, and you'll notice the similarity with the first stage. Verse number 6 says, and when Joshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man unto his inheritance to possess the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel. Now, look down just at verse number 10. And also, all that generation were gathered unto their fathers. So you can see that that's two generations. And all that generation were gathered unto their fathers, and there arose another generation. And this gives us a third generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. And just notice this expression. It will occur 7 times in the book. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Let's pick that up again in chapter 3. And look with me at verse number 7. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, look at verse number 9. And when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised up a deliverer. Just look back to chapter 2 for a moment. If I can get the expression here. Verse number 16. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges. And from that, we get the title to the book. Now let's go over to chapter 17. I realize I'm reading sporadically and briefly. So that's the task I've been given, just to give an opening to the book, or an overview of the book tonight. And let's look at chapter 17. And at verse number 1, there was a man in Mount Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said unto his mother, and of course we come down. Verse number 5, and the man Micah had a house of gods, and made an ephod and teraphim, and consecrated one of his sons, who became his priest. In those days, verse 6, there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And there was a young man out of Bethlehem, Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he comes to Mount Ephraim as the story continues. Look at chapter 18, verse 1. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Look at chapter 19, verse 1. And it came to pass in those days that there was no king in Israel. And come over with me, please, to chapter 21. Chapter 21, please. And again, we could read quite a bit here, but let's read it, verse number 24. 21, 24. And the children of Israel departed thence at that time, every man to his tribe and to his family. And they went out from thence, every man to his inheritance. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And God bless to us this reading of the sacred scriptures and give us the grace of the Holy Spirit as we speak therefrom. Now, our brethren, as our brother David has intimated tonight, our brethren have been moving through the book of Genesis and have arrived at chapter 50, the concluding chapter of that book. And in their considerations from what they have communicated to me, they began to think of a book that might meet present needs and which might speak to our hearts in the generation in which we are found. And they decided to take a look at the book of Judges, as our brother David has intimated. Now, we know the history quite well. I'll go over it quickly because it's really not my intention to stay with this aspect of it. We know from the book of Genesis that Jacob was directed in chapter 46 down into Egypt. And we remember the history that Jacob, along with his family, they went down into Egypt and they were gathered there in a place that Joseph apportioned for them in the land of Goshen. We're aware of the history that in the land of Goshen they flourished. And you will remember coming into the book of Exodus, there arose a king, a new king in Egypt, and he knew not Joseph. And of course, we're aware of what transpired. You remember the persecution, you recall the affliction, and of course, we're aware of the moment when God brought them out. We think of redemption, redemption by blood, chapter 12, redemption by power, when he brings them through the Red Sea. And of course, that speaks to us. We have known redemption, Lord, from bondage worse than theirs by far. Almost defaulted into Irish there. But we have known redemption by blood and redemption by power. And of course, we're aware of the wilderness journeys. It wasn't God's intention that they would stay in the wilderness. You recall, after Egypt, they come to Mount Sinai, or Horeb, the Mount of God. It was 3 months' journey. And when they come to Sinai, they're gathered at the mount. God wanted to communicate the law to them. He did that from Sinai. It was only 11 days' journey to the promised land. And God's intention was, from the mountain of Sinai, those 11 days would be taken and they would come into their inheritance. And we know the sad story. Now, we do know that Moses passed off the scene. And when Moses passed off the scene, there was a new leader that arose under the auspices. He was trained by Moses, as we would say. Moses mentored the man, and he comes. He is like Moses in a sense. His name is Joshua, and Joshua was the man that brought the people in. And we move to the book of Joshua, the preceding book to the book of Judges. It's estimated, I might come back to this, just depending on the time. It is estimated that the book of Joshua covers a period of approximately 30 years. That's an estimate. Some wouldn't go as extensive as that. Some will say it will cover a period of 14 years. Some widen it out a little bit, and they say it's a period of maybe 17 years. And others, as I've suggested, will say it covers a period of 30 years. But be that as it may, we know that Joshua brought the people in. We know from the context and the data of the book that they were 7 years in conflict with the nations that were there in the land of Canaan. That much is given to us. There were at least 7 years as the conflict raged in the land of Canaan. One of the things that's very instructive for us is that there's a pivotal chapter in the book of Joshua. I'll come to Judges in a minute, I promise. There's a pivotal chapter in the book of Joshua, and that's chapter 18. And in chapter 18 of the book of Joshua, the people are gathered together in a particular place, and the tabernacle was erected. And as the tabernacle was erected in Shiloh, the Lord, he arranged that the people would gather there. The house of God has been established, and Shiloh becomes very instructive to us as we consider the book of Joshua. Now, I mention that because we'll be able to pick Shiloh up again in the book of Judges. But I've got to leave the book of Joshua and move into the book of Judges for the time available at our disposal tonight. The first thing I want to speak to you about is a perusal, or a consideration, or examination of the book of Judges, just in line with my alliteration tonight. I have called it perusal. And we're going to take a little walk, and we're going to peruse the book, and we're going to consider the book, and we'll think about some data and some of the details of the book of Judges. Now, as I've mentioned, and as our brother David before me mentioned, he considered and he suggested, and very rightfully so, that this book is right up to date for our generation. I have read the 2 times, and you'll likely have noticed this. The time in chapter 17, in verse number 6, is it? And the time right at the end of the book, Judges 21, verse number 25, when it is stated that the children of Israel and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And so we are face to face with a generation, and they're doing that which is right. Picked up a very interesting book today, or at least I was reading a PDF file. It was Mr. David Gooding, he's now in the glory, Professor Emeritus of Greek at Queen's University, Belfast. And Mr. Gooding, he said, as he was considering the latter section of the book of Judges from chapter 21, he said, well, when it comes to the house of Micah and his mother, and this Levite that comes along, that we'll speak about a little bit, you know, Moses told us to do some of these things. That was very strict. I mean, that was just Moses. Moses commanded these things. But, you know, this is a different generation now. Moses is gone. And even Joshua is gone. And the generation that has outlived Joshua, they're all gone. And it was a very strict thing that Moses commanded. You know, we'll just make our own gods here. That's basically what Micah was at. We'll have a few gods in the house here, and you know, there'll be a teraphim here, and we'll have some of these other things in the house, and I'll even get my own specialized Levite. He'll serve us here. That's what's going on in the book. And I think, beloved saints, that you can see from that there was a spirit of the age and a movement of the age. And we can see the very same thing around us just at this exact time. So the book is right up to date. Of course, I read to you the 4 expressions. That one in chapter 17, chapter 18, verse 1, chapter 19, verse 1, and right at the conclusion of chapter 21, there was no king in Israel. Now, it really wasn't God's intention at that time to give a king. It was ultimately God's intention that there would be a king, but that was the Lord Jesus. But don't forget that the form of government that God had initiated was what we know as a theocracy. There was going to be a kingdom of priests. Those priests would hear directly from God. Those priests would intercede. They would move into the presence of God and receive the mind of God, and from the presence of God move out to the people, and God would be king, and God would reign amongst his people. That was God's intention. And of course, they decided that they wanted to be like the nations around them, and they desired a king. And God gave them what they wanted. Now, of course, we're moving into the books, or the book of Samuel, when we mention that. So I leave that. I do mention it in the book of Judges just to show that in their mind, there was an absence of authority. No king in Israel. Now, God got to be careful at my disposal. But don't forget, even for us, God is still on the throne. And it might seem that there is no authority. And it might seem that we're in difficult days, and in the difficulty of where we are, where is the authority? Well, beloved saints, God was still on the throne in the days of the judges. Dark days, difficult days, days when, dear Christians, if we bring it up to date into our language, dear believers would be more appropriate in the Old Testament. Days when dear believers might say, these are difficult days, and these are dark days, and these are days when we don't know where to turn. But don't forget, behind it all, in all of the darkness, God was still on the throne, and God was still over it all. So the perusal of the book, it just shows us difficult days and dark days, and every man doing that which was right in his own eyes. Now, the second thing I mentioned, I want you to consider with me the place of the book. And obviously, I've already given a little bit of this. In our English Bible, it's very instructive that in our English Bible, we've got the 5 books of Moses, what the Jews call the Torah, the teacher or the instructor. And then we've got the book of Joshua, following the book of Joshua, the book of Judges. And historically, that's very interesting. I actually picked up just a Hebrew Bible today in my study. And I just did it again just to remind myself. One of the things I was interested in was this. After the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, then there is a second section that opens in the Hebrew Bible. And in the Hebrew Bible, the next section is the Nevi'im. And that means the prophets. Now, it's slightly different from the order that we have in the King James or in our English translations. And you say, what do you mean by that? Well, in the book or the section of the prophets, you have Joshua, you have Judges, you have Samuel, and you have Kings. Then you've got the book of Isaiah, you've got the book of Jeremiah, you've got the book of Ezekiel, and you've got the 12 minor prophets. And that's all together in a Hebrew Bible in what is known as the prophets. You say, why are you pointing this out? I just want, and I'll be coming back to it practically in a moment. In our English Bible, we can move through and we can see the details historically. You can do that in a Hebrew Bible as well. But in the Hebrew Bible, it is associated with the section called the prophets. So it's not just historical. What I'm pointing out to our minds is this. This is also prophetical. Now keep that in mind. And you say, in what way prophetical? Well, we'll just leave that for a moment and we'll deal with the historical context. We are moving into a historical period after two of the great men of history have passed off the scene. It was a very sad day when Moses left. And I say to everyone, and you will know what I mean by this, there are days, and we face them. The nation of Israel faced them, the day when Moses passed off the stage of history. And the Lord spoke and he said, Moses, my servant is dead. There was a day came when Joshua passed off the stage of history. And beloved saints, I have heard of days like this. We have actually faced days like this in our beloved province. I have been to funerals right in this hall, or at least in this area, and then back to the hall. I won't mention anything more, but you and I know those were sad days for us in the province. I am reminded of the passing of Mr. Ramsey. They tell me at the next PEI conference, after Mr. Ramsey passed and went into the Lord's presence, it was our beloved brother Jim Baker who spoke, and he spoke on a line at the PEI conference, and his line at the PEI conference that year was, when good men go. And they faced it historically. We have got the books, Joshua and Judges. And historically, we move through those books. And of course, the reason why I mentioned Moses and Joshua is this. They held lines for God. And they held truth for God. And there was something about their presence. Beloved saints, we are the poor when men of that caliber go home to the glory. Now, God always buries his workmen and carries on his work. I was a bit afraid that this was going to be dry and dusty, and just a dry and dusty overview tonight. But I'm in a line that I didn't anticipate and didn't even intend coming tonight as I thought about the ministry. But I'll come back shortly to the prophetical view. But I will just press that a moment. We, beloved saints, are standing on the shoulders of giants here. We have had men in the maritime and Atlantic provinces, and we are indebted to those men. And just as it has been stated, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. But don't forget, from failing hands, they have passed the torch. And the torch of testimony is ours now. And they were enabled by God to live and serve. And the same God that enabled them to live and serve is the same God that can enable us to live and serve. So there is very definitely a historical imprint as we are moving into the book of Judges. I have mentioned this, that it's connected in a Hebrew Bible with the Nevi'im, the prophets. And I have no doubt that the book of Judges is giving us a prophetical foreshadowing. So it's not just history. It is actually also a book of prophecy. Now, I won't develop this for you. I'll develop one aspect of it. I'll give you one glimpse into it in the book, and then I leave this for sake of time. Samson. You know, in the book, Samson is the last judge that is mentioned in the book. There are other judges apart from Samson. But let's just focus our minds just presently on Samson. Samson had a very supernatural, God intervening in a very supernatural way in his birth. Samson was raised up as a Nazarite. That is, there were vows that were assumed on the behalf of Samson, and Samson was a Nazarite right from his womb. That is, he was dedicated, or should have been dedicated, to the Lord. Samson had a vocation that he himself was to show forth the praises of God and live for God and demonstrate the power of God in his life. Samson became enamored with the people around him who were not believers. And of course, Samson, he fell as he became enamored with those Canaanitish or Philistine women. And of course, as a consequence of that, he relinquished his vows and he stepped away from his vows and he sinned. Because of his sin, you will remember Samson was brought down and he was brought low and he was brought into captivity. In captivity, he lost his liberty, he lost his power, he lost his spirituality. You remember eventually, he's blind. Oh, you say, that's a very interesting story. We know that story very well. And we assume that it's just at a historical level. We've got the story of Samson. That's prophetical. Now, it's prophetical in this sense that it pictures the nation of Israel, God's superintendent, the nation of Israel being born. God moved in a very spectacular way, and he called a man, Abraham. You can read it about it just in the preceding chapter from which we have read tonight, Joshua chapter 24. And you remember when Abraham was called, there was a nation, and they were separated unto the Lord, just like Samson was separated unto the Lord. You will remember their vocation, just like Samson's, was to show forth the praises of Jehovah and to be a missionary nation and to speak for God and to live for God, just like Samson. But they, like Samson, just became enamored with the nations around and the Canaanitish people. And as a result, they lost their separate character for the Lord. Because of that, they were taken into captivity. In captivity, they lost their liberty, they lost their spirituality, they lost everything. And you remember, just like Samson, the last king, he was blind. In fact, it has been often pointed out that the last king was blind, and the last judge in the book of Judges, you've got to be careful with that statement. Actually, someone, is this going on YouTube? Oh, okay. Because my dad said yesterday to me, I was telling him something, asking questions, and he said, well, don't forget the last judge was blind. That's true in the book of Judges, not true in the book of Samuel. But just keep that in mind. So the last king is blind, the last judge is blind in the book of Judges. The last remnant of the nation is blind because the Lord Jesus spoke, and he spoke to a remnant of the nation in the Gospels, and the Lord Jesus called them blind leaders of the blind. And when you go over to the book of Revelation, the 7 churches, you will find that the last church is blind. And so Samson is a picture of the nation. So this book is a prophetical book. And it shows us the history of the nation. But as it shows us the history of the nation, it is also giving us a prophetic unfolding, a prophetic foreshadowing of the nation. Now, again, at that point, I've got 7 of these to get through, and I think I've only tried to touch 2 of them, and I've got about 20, not quite 20 minutes left. The third thing, we've looked at the carousal, we're moving through the book, we're looking at the place of the book, both in the English Bible, and I've mentioned a little bit about the Hebrew Bible. The third thing, and I'll mention this quickly, I want to speak about the particulars of the book. Now, what do I mean by particulars of the book? By that I mean the divisions of the book. You will find, and I try to intimate this, you will find that there are 2 introductions. If you're reading chapter 1 right through into chapter 2, verse number 5, that's the first introductory section. From chapter 2, verse 6, right through to chapter 3, verse 6, is the second introductory section. Now, just look at it again. How do we make that out? Well, if you look at chapter 1, verse 1, after the death of Joshua. Look at chapter 2 and verse number 6, as we're moving into the second section, and when Joshua had let the people go. Now, you say, why is it that the author of the book does this? Who was the author of the book? That's a good question. See, the benefit is this. I know if my overview is a bit light, some of my brethren here, I don't know who will minister next Wednesday evening. They'll fill in any, oh, it must be David. This David's pointing across the hall. So it's the pressures of David McClelland here. And he'll be able to fill in any of the details that I'm not mentioning tonight about some of the aspects of the book of Judges. Most likely, the author was Samuel. Most likely, but we leave that. Well, why did the author do this? Why introduce just over a chapter? Why introduce one introductory section and then a second introductory section before we come to the 2 main bodies of the book? Why do that? I would suggest to you that the whole purpose is this. In the first aspect of introduction, it shows Joshua and the generation immediately that followed Joshua. That's the reason for that. You say, what about chapter 2, verse 6? It shows Joshua and the generation that followed Joshua, and then the generation that followed that. And the whole point is this, to show us that we have moved to a 3rd generation. And that's the reason for the twofold aspect of introduction. Now, you say the 3rd generation. Be careful of the 3rd generation. I hate to tell you this. I think that I'm a 3rd generation Christian. By that I mean my father was saved and my grandfather was saved. If you analyze these historical books, you generally find that truth is relinquished and let go of in the 3rd generation. You see, when you come over into chapter 17 and 18, there's a Levite there. Who was that Levite? The fact is, just take a moment and we'll actually read it. Just read chapter 18 with me and verse number 30. And that will actually pinpoint and put our finger on it so that you have the reference. Chapter 18, verse number 30. And it says, the children of Dan set up a graven image. And Jonathan, now notice, 1. The son of Gershom, 2. The son of Manasseh, 3. 3rd generation. He and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. But I ask you again, Who was the Levite? Oh, you say, it's Jonathan. Who was the son of Gershom? Who was the son of Manasseh? Who was Manasseh? That's actually a scribal emendation. You say, what do you mean by that? What I mean by that is this. There was a word in the Hebrew text, and some of the scribes changed it because they were embarrassed. You see the word Manasseh there in chapter 18, verse 30? It should actually be Moses. Who was Moses? He was the leader. He lived and served God. He had a son whose name was Gershom, who had a son whose name was Jonathan. And this whole business of this Levite, in those two chapters, chapter 17 and 18, is actually a grandson of Moses. So you can see, beloved saints, that here is truth that is being given up in the third generation. And that's the purpose. And you can actually see there a parallelism between chapters, the first section of the book of Judges and the last section of the book of Judges, the particulars of the book. Now, having mentioned that, there is a major section, right from that chapter 3, verse 6. That's the beginning of a major section. And from chapter 3, verse 6, right through to the end of chapter 16, it's taken up with Judges. One of the things I didn't mention, I intended to do it, and our brethren will definitely be filling in a lot of material if I don't do this. One of the things I've intended to do is actually mention the term Judges. I guess we can do it now. The title of the book is taken from it. I read chapter 2, verse 16, that the Lord raised up judges. So from chapter 3, verse 6, right through to the end of chapter 16, that is taken up with a section dealing with judges. Now the whole focus there, this is what I want to point out. The whole focus in that section is that which is national and governmental. And you say, this business of judges, what did it mean? It didn't have the legal connotation that a judge would mean to us. The word to judge, or the word judges, it simply means a leader. Now sometimes it will include the aspect of a military work. It doesn't always include that. But it does have the idea of a champion that is raised up. Servitude, and the people were in bondage, and there were those in the land that were bringing them down, circumstances around them, it was crushing in on them, and the Lord raised up a leader. Sometimes it's a male, sometimes it's a female. We will read about Deborah. Deborah in the book is called a judge. She judged Israel. And so there were leaders that were raised up. We will find in Deborah's case that she didn't militarily go to battle. She didn't. There was another man alongside her. His name was Barak, and he went to battle. But keep in mind, when we're speaking about judges, really it has the connotation of leadership. And if there ever was a day that we needed leadership, here are men and women, and they were able to show leadership in a difficult day. You know, beloved saints, it falls upon me. I'll apply this first of all to myself. And it falls upon everyone here to show leadership in a difficult day. Well, you say, you don't know my circumstances. You see, in my peer group, if I step out, I have some friends at school, and they say they're Christians, but they don't live like Christians. And if I step out of my peer group, I'll be the odd one out. Well, I'm sure that there's a man called Othniel here, and he thought he would be the odd man out. There's a man called Jephthah. I think he thought he'd be the odd man. Many of them were. Well, maybe I should clarify that. They're different. I mean, there's a man with a left-handed fellow. You got to watch those boys. I don't know. I said in a Bible reading here just the other week that they tend to be, for us at least, they tend to be the smarter ones. I mentioned Mr. Sandy Higgins and Mr. Gene Higgins, and I mentioned Mr. David Oliver, and I mentioned our good brother David Hurley, and Mr. Gilliland. He's another one. And I started to think about these preachers that are left-handed, and I feel a little bit out of it. But you will find through the book of Judges, a man had an ox goad. You say, what could a man ever do with an ox goad? But he was a leader amongst God's people. And he was raised up in a difficult day, and he was raised up as a leader and as a judge. so that he would have a place and a position, and God raised them up. Now that's enough about the judges and leadership. If our brethren want to develop that on another evening, they can do that. But don't forget the principle now. Chapter 3, verse 6 to the end of chapter 16, we are looking at something that is national and governmental. We say, what about the rest of the book? Chapter 17 and 18, that's a section. Chapters 19, 20, and 21, that's a section. And it's dealing with two Levites. It's not so much what's national and governmental, it's what's moral and spiritual. That's what's going on in that section of the book. It's not so much a governmental thing, it's a spiritual thing, because those two men were Levites. Do you know what a Levite was? A Levite was a person that was supposed to serve God. And you look at what is happening in the lives of these Levites. And you think of what is happening in their circumstances and the vocation that they have left. And you can very readily tell it's not a governmental problem. It was a moral problem and a spiritual problem. And you say, what's the antidote? Is there anything that can fill in all of these difficulties and all of these problems, and every man doing that which was right in his own eyes? There's another little book. One of our brethren actually mentioned it in prayer tonight. I thought that's good, because hopefully that will remind me just to mention. It's a little book called Ruth. And you say, what's that got to do with the book of Judges? Well, it was in the day when the judges ruled. And you say there were governmental problems. That's that first big major section. And there were moral problems and spiritual problems. That's that latter section from chapter 17 right through to chapter 21. What's the answer to that? Thank God, that's the book of Ruth. And you remember, I'll throw this out, I've hardly time to deal with it. You remember, you see the first book. I'll go back to the Hebrew Bible. What's the first book of the Hebrew Bible? Oh, you say that's Genesis. That's right. What's the last book of the Hebrew Bible? Someone says that's Malachi. No, that's our English Bible. The last book of the Hebrew Bible is Chronicles. There's actually a number of correlations between Genesis and Chronicles. One of them I will give you, and I'll pass off this quickly, is Genesis opens with genealogies. And right through the book of Genesis, genealogies. These are the generations of, I think the term Toledoth. These are the generations. It occurs 11 times in the book of Genesis, and 10 of them are fundamental to the structure of Genesis. So it's all about generations, and it's all about genealogies. You see, when you come to the book of Chronicles, I know it's 1st and 2nd Chronicles with us. Originally it was one book. You will find it opens with genealogies. Is there any other book in the Bible, whether it's the Hebrew Bible or our English Bible, that gives us genealogies? There's a little book. It's called the Book of Ruth. What's it all about? You know one of the reasons why the book of Ruth is there? It gives us genealogies that are going to link to one singular person. You say that was Boaz. Boaz is there, thank the Lord. But Boaz is only a picture of another person. It gives us genealogies that are linking to Christ. And the answer for governmental problems and the answer for moral and spiritual problems is given to us in the book of Ruth, that deals with an individual that was prepared to live for God. Let me ask you now, is there someone here, and in the midst of the darkness that we see around us, you are saying, I would like to live for God? It's just a little book of Ruth. There's a woman, Naomi, and she's restored. Restoration's a wonderful thing. There's a dear woman, Ruth, and she's converted and brought amongst the Lord's people. And both of them individually associated with Boaz, the mighty man of wealth. They live for God. I tell you, beloved saints, listen, the book of Judges is a dark book. The book of Judges is a difficult day. The book of Judges is a day of declension. It's still possible to live for God. If we only paint the dark picture, we are doing a disservice, not only to this book, but to everyone that is here tonight. Live for God, and serve God, and love God, and appreciate Christ. And you will find that the book of Ruth, it opens that vista up very nicely for us. Now, I was going to mention some other things in the particulars. I'll mention the plan of the book, the perusal of the book, the place of the book, the particulars of the book. I will speak for a moment about the plan of the book of Judges. As I have mentioned, in the first major section, you will find it divides into 6. Now, we'll have to deal with these personalities. Our brother David Cress, I'm going to tell him. When I came into the hall tonight, he said to me, how many judges were there? Well, I can see from the way the time's going here for me, our brother David might have to answer that next week. So we'll deal with the plan of the book. And if I don't get to outline the personalities in the book, that's okay. I'll leave it to one of our brethren for next week, Lord willing, and that will give him a jump-off place, and it will save me from telling you how many it is in the book and how many is in Samuel and things like that as well. Well, the plan of the book, in the first major section, you will find that 6 times we read, the children of Israel did that which is evil. If you want I'll just give you it. I actually have a little note, as you would expect in my own Bible. You will find the first one in chapter 3, verse 7. Just as this first man, Othniel, is raised up, chapter 3, verse 7, before he's raised up, the children of Israel did that which is evil. The next one's chapter 3, verse 12, and then Ehud is raised up. The next one's chapter 4, verse 1, and then Deborah comes on the scene. The next one is chapter 6, verse 1, and Gideon moves onto the scene. Chapter 10, verse 6, and Jephthah, he is seen as a judge. Chapter 13, verse 1, and Samson comes onto the page of history. And just before each one of those 6, we read that expression, the children of Israel did that which was evil. You will find this. We start here, quite high. And the moral declension of the day, it's a downward spiral, just a downward spiral. From that first judge, Othniel, there's a downward spiral. And it just seems to be that it replicates itself 6 times. And you say, what happens? Well, basically it goes like this. In the plan of the book, there is rest. Following rest, there is rebellion. Following rebellion, there is retribution. Following retribution, there is repentance. Following repentance, there is restoration. And if you check the 6 cycles, that repeats itself. Only the cycle gets lower and lower and lower as we move through the 6 cycles in the book of Judges. I am aware, just in case some of my brethren tell me at the door, some believe there's a 7th cycle. I am aware of that. I'm not convinced of it myself. I personally think that the stamp of the number 6 marking the book is actually a more accurate thing, the number of man marking the book of Judges. There is another man, he is not called a judge. And you will find it's in chapter 8 and in verse number 33, there's a man, his name is Abimelech. It does not say the children of Israel did that which is evil, but it says this, the children of Israel turned again. Now the man is definitely not a judge. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And I don't even think that that's a section. Although when I get to heaven, I'll be asking my brother J.M. Davies, because I've got his book at home. I didn't look at it today, but it's a few years since I read it. But I remember that Mr. J.M. Davies, he suggests very definitely that there are 7 cycles in that major section of the book of Judges. Now, I've got to leave this. Time's gone, or time is going. The last thing I will mention, I was going to mention the personalities. Our brother David can have a jump-off point from that next week. I was going to mention the period of the book. How long does the period of Judges last for? It has been suggested approximately 340 years. Now, just to put that into context, the period of the kings lasts for 450 years. So approximately the period of the kings is 1/4 longer than the book of Judges. But this whole period is basically put together into the confines of one book. The period of the kings jumps off right from Samuel, right through the whole of the rest of the Old Testament. So keep that in mind as we are moving through. That's the period of the book. The last thing I mentioned are the parallels to this book. Are there any parallels to the book of Judges that will help us? It has been suggested, and I believe it, that the book of Joshua parallels the book of the Acts. Again, I don't have time to develop this, but I would suggest it to you. Think about it. The first sin in the land, what was it? Well, you say it was covetousness. Achan, that's right. That's in the book of Joshua. The first sin in the church, what was that? That was covetousness. That was Ananias and Sapphira. You remember Acts chapter 5. So there's a clear correlation between the book of the Acts and the book of Joshua. Those first years when they're moving into the inheritance. Those first years in the church period when they're moving into the inheritance. You remember at the end of the book of Joshua, there's a man stands and he gives a statement to the people. You remember at the end of the book of the Acts, there's a man calls the elders of the church in Ephesus and he gives a statement to the Lord's people. So you can see the correlation between Acts and Joshua. But you say, what about Judges? Well, no matter how many periods you see or cycles, I think that the book of Judges would clearly correlate with the 7 churches of Asia in the book of Revelation. Now, I'm going to leave these things. Time is gone. There are a lot more parallels that we could draw tonight, but having left their first love, you can see it moving progressively downward until at last there's a poor blind judge. Having left their first love, you can see it moving progressively downward until the Lord actually speaks to the church in Laodicea and he says, thou art blind. You know, beloved saints, as we have intimated on a number of occasions tonight, this book is right up to date. This book speaks to our hearts, and I trust we will receive the message, and I trust it will challenge us in our life for God.